This video will help you understand some of the things you can and can't do with an inherited IRA. If you don't know who I am, my name is Chris Dime. I'm a financial planner out of Evans, Washington, and I specialize in working with folks to and through retirement. One of the most common assets to inherit after the passing of a loved one is a retirement account. Now, whether the original owner of the account had the money inside of a 401k, 403b, or an IRA, generally the beneficiary of that account, the person who's receiving the money, will get those proceeds by way of what's called an inherited IRA. The IRS classifies beneficiaries into three main designation types: eligible designated beneficiaries, non-eligible designated beneficiaries, and then non-designated beneficiaries. And I'll link below to some explainer videos that dive a little bit deeper into the definition of those. And even for spouses who are a form of eligible designated beneficiaries, there's some extra rules and nuance to be aware of. In addition, for all these, there's some extra nuance as to whether or not the decedent had met their required beginning date or not, which is the date in which they need to start taking out required minimum distributions. Generally, that's going to be when someone's in their early mid-70s. Now, regardless of which beneficiary type you're classified as, if you are the one inheriting this money, you'll have some common rules to follow. And so in today's video, we'll jump through what those are. So let's jump in. A lot of what we talk about today is coming from an Ed Slott article from IRAhelp.com. I'll link below to the original article, but the Ed Slott website is a phenomenal resource for kind of open source dialogue on some nuanced IRA planning stuff if you find yourself in a sticky situation and you don't want to go hire a tax professional for some advice. Now, of course, there's probably a disclaimer out there that nothing on there constitutes tax advice, but it's pretty close and accurate stuff, and generally there's some references to, maybe an Internal Revenue Code section you can look up further. So now on to some of the do's and don'ts. So first we'll cover the don'ts. These are things that you shouldn't do if you inherit an IRA. Number one, you can't contribute to this inherited IRA. Now, regardless of whether you're a spouse or not, if the money is categorized as an inherited IRA, you are not allowed to make contributions to that inherited IRA. You're also not allowed to make any sort of rollovers from other accounts, nor transfers. For example, if you're doing a 401k to inherited IRA rollover or transfer, you're not allowed to do that. If you remember from a previous video, which I'll link above here, the spouse has some unique rules when they're the ones inheriting retirement monies, but they're the ones ultimately deciding whether or not they are going to mark this account as an inherited IRA, to which they couldn't make contributions to, or they're usually permitted the option to turn this money into their own IRA. And if they mark the account as their own IRA, well then theoretically they could still make contributions, of course, if they fall in line with other Internal Revenue Code guidance. But in that case, it would no longer be an inherited IRA, so these rules wouldn't apply. But for everybody else, if you're going to inherit a retirement account, you can't make contributions to that account. The other thing you can't do is you can't convert this inherited IRA money into an inherited Roth IRA if the money came to you as an inherited pre-tax IRA. Now, of course, if you inherited the money as an inherited Roth IRA, well, then there's no Roth conversions to be done. But specifically as it pertains to inheriting pre-tax IRA money, which is the most common way nowadays that people will inherit money, you can't do Roth conversions to maybe avoid some downstream income taxes from required minimum distributions. Now, some of the things you can do with an inherited IRA is you can move the account if you're not a particular fan of the investment custodian that the account's with. So for example, let's say dad or grandpa was a huge fan of working with Schwab, but you've got all your money over at Fidelity. You're totally permitted to move your inherited IRA over at Schwab to a Fidelity inherited IRA. Now, to move the money, it has to be a direct trustee to trustee transfer. There's no indirect rollover permitted. And for a quick refresher on an indirect rollover, that's where the investment custodian strokes you a check for the money that's in your 401k or IRA. And then that money goes into your bank account, and then within 60 days, you get that money back into an IRA somewhere else. Now that's permitted when moving money from a 401k or another IRA, but it's not permitted when moving inherited IRA money around. Now, I've seen some folks make the argument that you might want to move investment custodians because, one investment custodian might have access to particular investments that another investment custodian might not have access to. I would say for 99% of consumers out there, that really should not be the reason that you move the money, because pretty much any investment custodian is going to have access to pretty much anything that makes sense. A word to the wise here: if you do move the money so that you can either run a self-directed IRA, which in the classical definition means an IRA that you're using for things like private real estate investing, for example. But if you choose to invest in more illiquid investments like private real estate or alternative investments, depending on how you inherited this account, if you're the surviving spouse of the loved one, you theoretically could mark this account as your own IRA, but as we touched on, then it's no longer an inherited IRA. For everybody else, you're going to have some form of required minimum distribution. Now, that's either going to be a required minimum distribution for the years following immediately after the year of death, or it's going to be at one big lump sum down the road. So the point I'm getting at here is the investment selection within the Inherited IRA should make sense based on your time horizon for needing the money. In a very simple way, what I'm trying to communicate is I would not recommend investing in very illiquid investments or things that could become illiquid within these inherited retirement accounts, because the last thing you want is for your money to be locked up in a security that you can't turn into cash and liquidate and satisfy the IRS's mandated required minimum distribution. That could absolutely leave you in a world of trouble. And for the return expectations above and beyond the classic, S&P 500 index-oriented portfolio, I have a hard time thinking that the juice is going to be worth the squeeze. Now, as you might know if you've been following me for a while, the IRS has forgiven those who did not take required minimum distributions for the past few years. If they were a non-eligible designated beneficiary and they needed to take out required minimum distributions, but they didn't. But I have a hard time thinking they're going to continue forgiving people. And definitely in the 10th year, we all pretty much know by now that you'll have to have the entire account liquidated in year 10. So I doubt the IRS will be issuing out forgiveness in the 10th year. Now let's touch on some of the things you can do. So you can do a qualified charitable distribution. And I'll link above to an explainer video on how that works. But ultimately, a lot of times when folks are inheriting this money, if they already have a well-established investment portfolio or a very sizable balance sheet, and they don't necessarily need this money, it can actually just hurt them from an income tax standpoint, whereby they have to take out a required minimum distribution from this account in one fashion or another. But if they don't need the required minimum distribution, then that just adds to their tax liability for that year. And that could be pretty frustrating. So for those who are more charitably inclined, you could look into doing a qualified charitable distribution. Now the rules say you have to be 70 and a half or over in order to do a qualified charitable distribution. So this might not apply to that many people watching, but ultimately it still is an option. And the limits for 2024 is up to $104,000. So theoretically you could gift $104,000 out of this inherited IRA and you wouldn't pay any income taxes. Now you'd have to make that money go directly from the IRA to the charitable institution. You wouldn't want to take receipt of the funds and then pass it along to the charity, but theoretically 104 grand is your limit. But keep in mind, if you are planning to do this out of your account and you choose to donate more than the required minimum distribution, that's all well and good. And of course you save income taxes doing that, but that doesn't satisfy future year RMDs. So for example, if this year my RMD was 50 grand and next year my RMD is 50 grand from my inherited IRA, I can't gift a charity 100 grand this year and have it satisfy this year and next year's required minimum distribution. The last thing that I think is important to touch on that you can do is you can liquidate this entire account without any sort of tax penalties. Now, there are tax consequences to liquidating the money out of this account and putting it into your bank account. Namely, if the money comes to you as a pre-tax IRA, if there's no non-deductible IRA money inside the IRA, then the distribution is fully income taxable to you. If there is some non-deductible IRA money in there, we'll kick out a future video on how pro rata distributions work, but to keep it simple, a portion of that distribution will be taxable and a portion won't. Think of it like a mini Roth IRA is embedded within the IRA. But also, you wouldn't pay any sort of penalty taxes if you inherited a Roth IRA and totally liquidated the account. Now there is one caveat with Roth IRAs, and that's if the Roth IRA didn't meet the 5-year seasoning rule, which I'll push out a future video on explaining exactly how that works. But to keep it simple, if any money was added to this Roth IRA within 5 years of you inheriting the money, then there's a chance the money that you're pulling out of the Roth IRA could still be subject to income taxes on the growth. There's a 5-year rule. You can do some Googling on it, or you can just wait for a future video, but something to be aware of if you do inherit a Roth IRA. But to keep it simple, no matter what you do, you won't face a 10% early withdrawal penalty if you're under the age of 60. So calls to action wise, if you think you're about to inherit an IRA, I'd come up with a plan ahead of time as to what you're going to do with these proceeds. But of course, if you've already inherited an IRA, I'd re-examine your current situation and what your distribution schedule is, and just make sure you've checked the box and you're not violating any IRS precepts and or you're taking advantage of what you could access to if, for example, you needed liquidity today and you weren't aware that you could liquidate the whole account if you wanted to. At the end of the day, hopefully that was helpful. If you have further questions, drop them in the comments below or get in touch on the website. We'll get you squared away. Have an awesome rest of your day. We'll talk to you later. Bye.